Okay. Good.
And so what we're looking at here is this is a capital amputation set. Every regimental surgeon would be issued one of these things. And this one, I believe, was somebody's personal kit because it's a lot smaller than the ones the government issued. But when I bought this, I made sure that this was a period set. It was manufactured by George Tiemann in New York, who was one of the best, certainly a domestic manufacturer of medical instruments at the time, the Tiemann Company. So this one was definitely around during the war. I can't prove that it was actually used in the war, but I suspect it was. But the thing you notice about Civil War medical instruments is they have wooden handles, right? Well, you can't sterilize wood, but it didn't matter because they didn't sterilize their instruments. So it was a moot point, right? And the other thing you notice about these cases, they're all this plush red velvet. I'm not sure if it's red so you don't see the blood, but the plush red velvet is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Now, they didn't know that, and they didn't care about that because they didn't think bacteria were related to these infections they saw. They knew bacteria existed because they had microscopes, but they thought bacteria were something that came in later, sort of secondary invaders to clean up things, rather than that they were the primary cause. They did identify contagion, but they thought that was most diseases that were contagious were spread through the air. Some were, some weren't, but they thought all of these were. In fact, the term malaria means bad air. And because that was the observation, if you got near a swamp, you got malaria. They didn't recognize the mosquitoes, that came later. But they thought that there were so-called miasms or bad air coming out of the swamps that was causing malaria. So, these are all the things that were believed back then. So the operations, of course, are all going to be done without any kind of aseptic technique. They're going to be operating barehanded. They're not going to be sterilizing any instruments. Over there, you see the apron, which because surgeons are officers, you've got to provide your own uniform. So you'd wear an apron to protect it from bodily fluids. The other thing you could do, though, with the apron is use that to wipe off instruments between patients. One of my favorite stories is reading about the description of a surgeon who's going to help a patient off the table. So he sticks the handle of the amputating knife in his mouth, and he helps the patient off the table. The other thing they would do, they sutured the blood vessels. So to thread the needle, they would lick it, like some people do today. Yeah, but it was the conception was totally different. Once they started to sterilize the instruments in the post-war period, then they all became steel handled. And initially carbon steel, and of course today they're all stainless steel. So if you collect these things, you'll know you're dealing with period instruments if they have wooden handles. That's in the general time frame, pre and during the Civil War and immediately thereafter. So the question always comes up about anesthetic. Did they use anesthetics? Well, 95% of the time they did. The most common anesthetic was chloroform because ether, which was also used, was flammable. So you wanted to use ether more in the general hospital away from the battlefield. Now, the issues with chloroform are when you give it, it causes muscle contraction, the so-called state of excitement. So the attendants would have to hold the patient down. In addition, chloroform is toxic. It can damage the liver. So you only give enough to make the person insensible to pain. Well, that would result in the fact that during the operation, they might be moaning and groaning. So somebody observing these operations, they're holding the patient down, he's moaning and groaning, would falsely conclude that they're operating without anesthesia. Of course, Hollywood movies have propagated that myth too. You can read, actually, because the anesthesia is relatively light, you'll read diaries of soldiers One guy said, I had my arm amputated. I heard the bone saw, but I didn't feel any pain because he was awake enough to hear it, but not to feel it. And so that all that propagates the myth. So 95% of the time they actually operated with anesthetic. Like I say, they use chloroform more than ether just because ether is flammable. The most common way to give anesthesia was to take a cloth, a handkerchief, any kind of cloth material, put it in the cone shape. You put about an ounce in, and you hold it over the mouth and nose. They had ether cones more in the general hospitals. You have a sponge in here, you put it in. And then later in the war, they actually a Confederate surgeon named Jon Willen invented a thing called the Chisholm inhaler. It's metal with two prongs on it. It's got a sponge and a disc, and you only need 1/8 of an ounce. And it was designed to conserve the anesthetic agent. You just put that in the prongs in the nose and inhale. And there was a Union and a Confederate version. Since it wasn't invented till December of 1864, it wasn't used very extensively until really after the war. But the point is, you wouldn't have to come up with a device to conserve anesthetic if you didn't use it. And they used it. And they gave 80,000 anesthetics in the Union Army. They did 30,000 amputations, which means about 50,000 times you're going to be using anesthesia for other things. For example, if you had to probe deeply for a bullet, that's very painful. They would sometimes what they call etherize you before they did that. They developed in 1863 treatment of hospital gangrene called bromide. They would take the substance called bromine, pipette it or pour it onto a wound. It's very caustic. It just eats up the tissue literally. So you'd have to put the person to sleep before you could even do that. So, these are other examples of how you would use anesthesia for other things than just surgery. People always ask, why did they do so many amputations? And the answer is, if you look at the bullets. And so the bullets are these 68, 69 caliber called mini balls. They were invented by a Captain Claude Minet of the French Army by the 1847, 48 period. It came to the United States. Minet became mini. So they call it mini ball. But with a mini ball, these are from actually dug up in the Shiloh battlefield. These are not expended. These are round balls. But these two are unexpended mini balls. And when they hit something hard like bone, they will go from this shape and they'll flatten out into a mushroom shape, about 90 caliber. And what is that going to do to the bone? It's going to shatter it, right? So that's the indication to do an amputation, because they know that if the bone gets shattered like that, you're going to get an infection. We don't have any antibiotics back then. So if you operate within 48 hours, you can reduce the mortality from around to about half. So the idea is to operate as quickly as you can. So the indications to do these operations is, number one, a shattered bone. We call that today a compound comminuted fracture. Number two, an injured blood vessel. Or number three, a bullet through a joint. Any one of those three or combination thereof is the indication to do an amputation.
How much did their equipment weigh?
How much did it weigh? That's how much it weighed. They weren't that heavy. This is heavy. But this is the Squibb Medical Pannier. R.J. Squibb was a naval surgeon in the Mexican War. He retires, and in the 1850s, he starts a company in Brooklyn called the Squibb Company, which is still around today, by the way. It's called BMS Squibb. And he comes up with the idea. He was in the right place at the right time because he became a principal purveyor of medical supplies to the Union Army. But what he came up with is called the U.S. Army Medicine Panier, which is 52 tins of various medications. It's not all medicine. There's coffee, there's tea, there's soup, beef extract in here, all kinds of things. But it's all number coded, all in Latin, so they know what everything is, and these are refillable. So I say there's narcotics like opium and morphine for pain. There's colchicine for gout. There is the coffee and the anesthetic agents, that kind of stuff. The rest of the stuff is either dangerous or worthless. It's heavy metals, antimony, mercury, arsenic, lead, all that kind of stuff, turpentine. All these kind of things can be dangerous, but they used them as medicines. And then there's stuff that just doesn't do much at all. Some of these potassium-based things and things like that. So there's just a whole panoply of stuff here. But the whole concept was totally different from the way we think today. In fact, some of this stuff was so entrenched that the Surgeon General was a guy named William Hammond. In 1863, he decided, antimony might be poisonous. Let's get rid of it. Mercury, not such a good move. Well, this thing was so entrenched in the medical profession that they trumped up charges against this guy and court-martialed him because of that. He later was vindicated after the war, but, the medical profession is extremely slow to change to this day, actually. But it just, you don't want to, he bucked the establishment, and you don't want to do that. So Hammond unfortunately paid the price. But this thing could be taken out into the field easily. The tins were either glass or tin. He sold them for $100 each, but he gave a discount for cash.
Is this original?
This is a repro.
Okay.
The National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick has originals in their collection. They're hard to find, the originals, but they have more than one.
Okay. That's great.